This is Charlotte Talks. I'm Alex Olgin, in for Mike Collins. The Year of the Women resulted in a surge of women winning office, from Congress to legislatures across the country. Women, for the first time, will hold more than 100 seats in the U.S. House. More than 2,000 women will hold seats in state legislatures, including 45 in North Carolina, the most in a decade. But the number of women in elected office is still far from matching the population. Here to talk about this are two women who were elected to the North Carolina General Assembly in seats that were previously held by men. Christy Clark will represent District 98, which is North Mecklenburg, and Rachel Hunt, who will represent District 103, which is Southeast Mecklenburg. Good morning to both of you.
Good morning.
And joining us by phone is Dr. Kelly Dittmar, scholar at Rutgers University's Center for American Women in Politics and co-author of A Seat at the Table, a Congresswoman's perspective on why their presence matters. Hi, Kelly.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yes, absolutely. If you'd like to join our conversation, you can email us at charlottetalks@wfae.org, join us on Twitter @CharlotteTalks, or watch us on Facebook Live. So first, two of you, congratulations to winning seats. That's very exciting. I know it's both first time in elected office. I'm just curious, we'll just start with you, Rachel. What inspired you to run for office?
So I have been inspired by watching the decline of our state since 2010, when the Republicans took the majority in the legislature, and the number of things they have done to damage our state. As many of you know, my father was former Governor Hunt, and his legacy was very threatened by what has happened, and I just could no longer stand by and watch that.
And I thought I heard you say earlier that you sort of knew you wanted to run for office, but you didn't know the timing exactly. Is that right?
Well, I've been asked to run for office for multiple years, so I didn't know if I would ever actually do it, but I knew I wouldn't do it until my children were out of the house.
So what changed this time around?
Well, they're left. They're out of the house.
Okay.
One is graduated from college and one is in college. So.
I see. And what about you, Christy? What inspired you to run for office?
Well, for a long time, I've been a volunteer with an organization called Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. And with that organization, I spent a great deal of time at our legislature. And I got to really see firsthand what was happening there with the good and the bad and the sometimes ugly. And I really could see what the potential could be. And that planted the seed for me to run for office.
Was it what you thought it would be like, the campaign?
The campaign was, I think, a straight uphill learning curve, but it was also a lot of fun. I really enjoyed learning about the issues that are important to constituents and getting out in the community and knocking doors and meeting people. It was hard and also really fun.
What about you, Rachel? Was it what you thought it would be, or I guess knew from experience, although I know your dad was in office many, many years ago?
Right. So there is nothing like being the candidate. Working on campaigns, donating to campaigns are nothing like being the candidate. And I view it as an odyssey. That's how hard it was, literally. The amount of money that had to be raised in my race, the amount of phone calls. It was a full-time plus, 20-hour-a-week job. And it was incredible. It was, an incredible learning experience, but it was very, very difficult.
I can imagine. And Dr. Dittmar, I know that you wrote a piece for the LA Times saying, yes, there were lots of gains for women all across the country, but we're still not even close to representative of the population. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Sure. I think that this year was a year where there was a lot of celebration because we had record levels of women running for office across levels of office, record numbers of women winning. But I want to be cautious, because if we think the work is done after this year, we'd be wrong, right? And so we want to maintain that momentum and energy and realize that we still have high levels of underrepresentation. So, for example, at the state legislative level, women will still hold 28% of seats, even though they're over 50% of the population. At the congressional level, it's important to celebrate the fact that we're over 100 women in the House, but remember the denominator is 435, right? So we have a long way to go to get to gender parity. So all of the talk about it being a year of the woman was right in one regard. It was an exceptional year for women's gains, but we don't want to make that seem as if it's an anomaly, something that only can happen in 1 year. And so we want to keep maintaining that enthusiasm as well as that focus to look at how we can even further expand the pool of women candidates as well as the number of women office holders.
And I was looking at data between state and local and national elected office and the growth in women representation, and it seemed to be fairly significant between the 70s and the 90s, and then in the 2000s plateau a little bit. And I was wondering, Dr. Dittmar, do you have any idea why?
Yeah, I mean, that stasis aligns with, I should say, the number of women running for office in part. So part of it is that we saw, an increase in the women running over time through the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. In 1992, the former quote-unquote years of women. And then those candidacy numbers stayed relatively stable, as did then the number of women in office. And so what we saw this year was sort of proof to the fact that if you have more women run for office, if you expand that pool significantly, you are going to see women win, and therefore you're going to see a gain in those numbers. So there's a lot of smaller factors to help explain what was happening in that time period, but certainly one of the biggest guiding factors is just expanding the pool of candidates. One other point to make is that this year, for example, even in a moment where we were talking about the surge of women or the pink wave or whatever you wanted to call it, women were still less than a quarter of all the candidates for the U.S. House, for example, and those percentages continued across different levels of offices. So that was an increase. We were up from about 18% in the last cycle, and therefore we saw that increase in gains. But we have a lot more room we could get to a pool of candidates that's closer to 50%.
Okay, I see. And I know, Christy and Rachel, you were both in Raleigh for orientation recently. Yes, there are more women, but not nearly, what did it seem like when you were there, sort of a breakdown?
Yeah, when you look around the room, you can see that there's still a majority of men in the room, and women are in the minority, and particularly women of color as well.
I see. And so, there's a lot of talk about women's issues, but I know a lot of what you guys ran on is education or common sense gun reform, things like that. Did you feel any pressure to talk about quote unquote women's issues while you were campaigning at all, either of you?
Well, I talked about issues that are relevant to everyone. So my whole campaign was very values laden. So at doors, I talked about education. Everybody has children or knows children or cares about children, and people really wanted to talk about their children and their experience and their schooling and what's going on. That was very important. Also, healthcare. Healthcare is a universal issue. And talking about Medicaid expansion, and people would tell me their stories of their horror stories with healthcare, and it was really, really impressive how people would open up at your door. And those are the issues that, resonated with my voters.
What about you, Christy?
Yeah, and I had the same. I talked about healthcare a lot when I was talking to voters, and I'm a cancer survivor, and so it was important to me to share that and to let voters know that I was wanting to expand Medicaid because I know what it's like to get a really devastating diagnosis and have to have that bill that follows it. And a lot of women have experienced that as well. They're, with breast cancer and ovarian cancer, and we would connect at the door on that issue. And gun violence is a woman's issue. Women are 5 times more likely to be shot and killed when there's a gun in the home and it's a domestic violence situation. And so that's something that carries through in all cases.
Yeah. Go ahead, Rachel.
But speaking of women's issues, one of the reasons we've had a surge in North Carolina in women running for office is they've gotten support from groups like Lillian's List. I was the board chair of that for the state, and we train women, we train the campaign managers, we give them money at the onset of their campaign and later on. And without that kind of support from other women, it's women helping women, you would not see the numbers that you've seen in the state.
Okay, interesting. And were you both asked to run for office, or did you both decide on your own, and you decided to call Lillian's List or other groups?
I was asked.
You were asked, Rachel? What about you,
Yeah,
Christy?
I after the 2016 presidential election, I immediately signed up with Lillian's List and Emily's List to be educated to be a candidate, and spent 2017 getting prepared. And when a representative came and gave the pitch on the importance of running for office, I said yes.
Okay. And I know, Dr. Dittmar, in some articles I've read, some of the difference between men running for office and women running for office is a lot of women are asked to run for office or recruited, whereas some men decide, I just want to do it. Can you expand a little bit more? Do you feel like that's a trend, or maybe overgeneralizing by some, articles?
Yeah, no, this is something we've seen in a lot of our research. And so, for example, we did a survey now in 2008 where we surveyed state legislators and we asked them, Were they more likely to be, quote unquote, self-starters? They made that decision on their own, or was encouragement important to their decision to run? And we did find consistently that for women it was encouragement mattered more. And that doesn't mean that women are just waiting to be asked. I think we want to sort of parse this finding out a little bit. What it means is women are rational decision makers, right? And so in many ways, they look at the costs of running, the financial cost, the personal, professional cost, and then they look at the benefits. And we have to make a strong case to women that the costs are worth it, that they are going to benefit more from running for office, and that they are going to make a difference. One of the things we found that was also different between men and women was that when we asked about their primary motivation to run, women said it was a policy issue. It was something I cared deeply about. You've already heard that from the women here, you know, the issues that matter deeply to them and their constituencies. For men, the top reason that they offered was because they always wanted to be an elected official. And so that's rooted in a different sense of socialization, but also matters if you're trying to make a case to get women to run in a period where government is seen as ineffective. It's incredibly difficult. So that encouragement, again, tends to matter more in making the case to women that they should do it. The last thing I'll say is that this year, I do think, and we haven't done a survey on this, so we don't know, but it does seem like the women who were running this year across the country, that among them there were more self-starters, more women who looked at what happened in the news, looked at what happened in 2016 and said, it's my time, it's time for more of us to be at the table, and didn't need necessarily the same levels of encouragement to run. The case was sort of made for them in what was happening and what they were seeing in the changes in policy agendas and outcomes at both the state and national level. So it may be that trend, as I mentioned at the start, is changing a little bit, or at least changed a bit this year. And
I take it, are you planning to continue studying, you know, sort of trends and stuff from this midterm, the 2018 midterms?
Yes, certainly. We looked this year. We sent out some information trying to do a candidate survey to try to get a sense of motivation for non-incumbent women running for the U.S. House, and also we're tracking that in other ways. And so we'll be doing sort of post-election analysis now that the dust has settled a little bit to try to look back at that information and see if we saw any different trends, and then also look forward. What does that mean as we move to 2020? I think Rachel's note about Lillian's list is so important. That support infrastructure is also key to helping women make the decision to run. So having programs and financial support structures in place that can help women once they make the decision to run, or even encourage them to make that decision in the first place, is important. And one thing we see that is really striking in this year was the real disparity between that support infrastructure for Republican women and Democratic women. And so as we go forward in terms of research as well as our programmatic work, we're going to try to be looking at as well, how can you level those support resources out a bit more so that we don't see a continued decline in the number of Republican women in office as well.
And Ryan, I wanted to get into that, and we're actually going to talk a lot more about the disparity between Republican women and Democratic women who were elected to both statewide, local, and national office after we get back from the break. You're listening to 90.7 WFAE. I'm Alex Olgin, in for Mike Collins. This is Charlotte Talks.
Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Greer Walker, a regional CPA and business advisory firm dedicated to understanding the language of global business, serving American companies expanding abroad and international firms in the Carolinas. GreerWalker.com. And Doctors Making House Calls, 105 primary care and specialty clinicians, helping complex patients avoid unnecessary ER visits and hospitalizations. Positions available throughout North Carolina. Info at DoctorsMakingHouseCalls.com. Tomorrow on Charlotte Talks, no other NBA franchise in the country has a history like our Charlotte Hornets. This 30th anniversary year, fans are remembering with nostalgia those early days of Hornets fever, the tumultuous days before the team moved to New Orleans, the years when we were the Bobcats, and later the triumphant return of the teal and purple to Charlotte basketball. On this edition of Charlotte Talks, we take a look back at Hornets history with a panel of experts who know the story as well as anyone else. That's tomorrow at 9 here on WFAE.
Federal prosecutors are investigating President Trump's inaugural committee, and his former personal attorney, Michael Cohen, is speaking out about the lies he told and the lies being told about him.
I should not be the only one taking responsibility for his actions.
The latest on this unfolding drama next time on 1A.
1A coming up from 10 to noon after Charlotte Talks on 90.7 WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source.
You're listening to 90.7 WFAE Charlotte Talks. I'm Alex Olgin in for Mike Collins, and we are talking to Rachel Hunt and Christy Clark, who recently the representatives elect at the General Assembly, and we are joined by phone from Rutgers University, Dr. Kelly Dittmar. So we were just talking about the disparity between the number of women that were elected in Democratic seats versus Republican. I know both Rachel and Christy are both Democrats. I know you mentioned that you were familiar with other people in the area running, especially other women. Were you familiar with any Republican women running, or was it mostly Democratic women?
I think I came across one locally running who came to one event that we had been invited to, but other than that, I hadn't seen very many. And then at our orientation in the House side, there was one Republican woman there as well.
Oh, wow, only one. And did you have the same experience?
I did.
Okay, so did you find that, I know the issues you talked about, public education, gun control, gun reform, those seem to be more Democratic issues. Did you find that with your constituents it was purely Democrat, or did you find people saying, well, I agree with you, I may be a Republican or I may be an independent, but, you're a woman, I really support women running for office? What kind of encounters did you have?
I ran in a mostly Republican district, so my entire experience was different from anyone running in a blue district. So I was mostly talking to folks who are either Republican or unaffiliated at the door, and so I didn't bring up that I was a Democrat. Some people asked me right off, and if I said I was a Democrat, they shut the door. So I was just trying to, use my values talk and, try to appeal to people's humanity.
Okay, what about you, Christy?
Yeah, I had mostly Republican unaffiliated doors as well, and I had a mixed reception at the doors. I had some times where people would say, it's time for women to get in office, we need that change, and then I'd also have times where people would say, I'm very conservative, and you're not for me, and that's okay, because we need people on both sides.
Right, absolutely. Go ahead,
And
Rachel.
certainly after the Kavanaugh hearings, things got really hairy in my district, and there was a lot of anger from Republican men directed towards me. And so, because I was a person knocking on their door running for office. So, it was a little scary some of the time.
Really? Because they were angry, did you feel sort of concerned for your safety?
Yes.
Oh, really? Like physical threats or just
Well,
yelling?
there weren't any threats,
Okay.
but I was by myself at the time canvassing, and that's when I decided I needed someone to accompany me.
Did you guys talk about the Brett Kavanaugh allegations because it was during the campaign? No?
No, I didn't really talk about it, but I did experience the same thing that Rachel did the day after the Kavanaugh hearing, knocking on doors of Republicans. They were very angry and upset and were not welcoming, and I took that as a sign to take a break from canvassing and go work on other things related to the campaign.
Men and women?
Both, yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. And so, Dr. Dittmar, I know that you mentioned that there were many more women, both in state legislators and on the national level, that were Democratic, that won seats. Do you think it's just because of the infrastructure that Democrats have set up on the local level and, even state or national level, or do you think that it's, what do you think it might be?
Yeah, I think that support infrastructure I was talking about, so it ranges from training and recruitment programs, as well as the financial PACs. So you look at Emily's list at the national level, Lillian's list. or other similar state-based PACs throughout the country, those organizations create additional support infrastructure and motivation for women to run and support once again they make that decision to do it. They're just not equivalent on the Republican side. There are far fewer targeted programs to women that are targeted, to Republican women. The financial infrastructure is much less. They're able to give much less money, to the extent that there even are a couple of those Republican women PACs. So that's a huge part of it. But what is behind that, I think, and is probably the larger problem, is the orientation of the Republican Party, the sort of philosophical orientation to what they would term identity politics. So the aversion to an actual targeted effort on the basis of gender is sort of antithetical to what the party has been saying, right? We don't play identity politics. Even recently, after the loss of women in the House, so the number of Republican women went from 23, already a small number, to 13 in the House this cycle. Only one of the 36 new members of the U.S. House is a Republican woman. So all of these numbers point to a big problem is getting national attention, as I'm sure you've seen. And you had the incoming head of the recruitment organization for Republican members of the House saying, I don't really think a targeted approach to try to recruit women is actually an effective strategy. And that was after all of this. And so there's also a challenge in that the party leadership is not really identifying this as a problem and need a solution. The caveat there is there are some Republican women who are calling it out as a problem, but the question is, do they have enough support from party leadership in order to make a difference in the next cycle?
Yeah, and I guess we'll just have to wait until 2020 to see if that starts happening. So one thing I wonder from everyone, both Rachel and Christy and Kelly, do you think that women either running for elected office or once in elected office, I know you both haven't been quite in elected office yet, but do you feel like the challenges that you might face are similar to challenges that women face in corporate America?
I would think so. It's a situation where men have traditionally had all the reins of power. Things are set up for men. For instance, we were just at orientation. The orientation for spouses was only for women. Some of our husbands didn't go because everything was aimed towards women's spouses.
Such as, can you give me an example?
Yeah, my husband was there at the spouse orientation, and he was very often told to pray for his husband.
Oh, no.
And so he had to politely point out that he had a wife, and he would pray for me.
Okay.
And so that was something, and that was directed that way. And also they were planning on having a fashion show, and they were not intending to include males, and he volunteered to be a participant.
Really? Is he going to participate?
He is, yes.
Oh, that's great. That's great. I'm sure I'll wear different outfits, but
Yes.
That's great.
And then, of course, in the structure, I think, of the House and the Senate and the way it's set up, it has been geared towards men primarily there. And a perfect example is the building was built in the 60s, and there aren't really great restrooms for women because they had to put them in as an afterthought. And so they are hard to find, and some of them are even built into what used to be a janitorial closet.
Oh, wow. Oh, my goodness. That is crazy. You would never think so. I mean, those are small things, but they add up, and I can see how they could be possibly discouraging or sort of frustrating. So your husband did not go, right?
He did not.
Yeah, and we sort of understand why. So, I mean, I know that there are many more important policy issues that you guys will address when you go to Raleigh, but are things like that also things that you guys want to address?
Absolutely. I think as more women come into the North Carolina General Assembly, we have to change the structure and the operations there to be more gender inclusive and be more welcoming of spouses that are men.
Yes.
And also things like the length of the session. This is set up so that it can go for an indefinite period of time. We are in the long session next year, and we are already heard that it's going to be quite long. And we have people that have children at home that are trying to maintain a job. It's a different group of folks coming in than the folks that are retired and, have grandchildren that have been in before. So we need to make allowances. We need to get things done. We need to be more productive. We need to work across the aisles, and that's exactly what I know I and Christy are planning to do.
Mm-hmm. You both sort of talked about yourself as problem solvers. Do you feel like that's a different tactic than you've seen representatives take in the past?
Yeah, I do. I think, and I think this is true in the freshman class on both sides of the aisle. We're coming in with a more open mind and a strategy to not be friends inside and outside of the General Assembly and to work together to move the state forward. I think that's something that came through in our orientation.
And Dr. Dittmar, I saw a map of women in different states and state legislatures, and it's lower in the South than it is in other parts of the country. I was a little surprised in the West it's higher in some states. Can you talk about the sort of geographical disparities?
Yeah, so there's not a clear, necessarily a clear indicator of, which states do better just due to geography, but certainly the numbers of women in the South have been lower consistently, in the West higher, and in Midwest and Northeast a little bit variable depending on the state you're looking at. And so some of those, some folks would talk about the roots in the West of women's empowerment from the frontier. So, to the point that in some ways you were making about the legislative body being built for and by men, also just general political and public institutions in these areas were built without women in mind, whereas in the West you had women more participatory in just the day-to-day life of sort of public life economically and elsewhere. So there's some of that cultural difference that may help to account for the differences in numbers, and then also the partisan differences. So where you have more Democratic control, you have more women. So there's a real close tie between partisanship and the increase or the numbers of women. And so that's why, for example, when you see a gain in Democrats this year across the country, it was boding well for women. I just wanted to speak one thing to add on to what the other women said about looking at the difference women make. We interviewed 83 women in Congress for our book, and one of the things that came through very clearly when we asked about the difference was they said, yeah, we deal with some of the traditional sort of sexist people doubting our qualifications, speaking over us still, even though we're in this institution. But we're so used to it that doesn't, it doesn't impede our ability to do our job. And more importantly, we're here because we want to get things done. And I think Rachel said that, and that is just so consistent across party lines, across generation lines of what the women say to us. We're here for achievement, not ego. And I think that bodes well for all of us if we're looking at how these institutions are going to break through some of that gridlock and try to make some policy progress.
Interesting. And Peter on Facebook wrote in, with voting strictly along party lines, how will women make a difference in the process? Will women vote outside what the party dictates? I'm wondering, do you think that makes a difference with men and women? Or once you're, in a caucus, you're going to vote along party lines of caucus? Now, of course, I'm not asking you to talk about all women because that would be crazy. But what about you, Rachel and or Christy, maybe for yourselves?
Well, I think, you have to weigh your constituency's needs versus what you're being told to do. And it's going to be, a balancing act for me because my constituency is not all Democrats. So, we're just going to have to see how it goes. And everyone's aware of that. We need to keep these seats that now that we've won, we need to keep our constituencies happy and believing that we're going to do the right thing for them.
What about you, Christy?
Yeah, I agree. And my district is about a third Democrat, Republican, unaffiliated. So I do have to take into consideration who makes up my voters. And I do want to support them. They elected me to represent them, and I should do the very best for them.
I see. So, and I know you're both new into these offices. Are there things that, in terms of voting, that maybe you align more with the other party? Or is it too early to know?
Yeah, I don't know yet.
Okay.
I would be hesitant to say.
Yeah, I don't want to speak in advance of something that
I
hasn't happened.
I understand. So you talked about the orientation. We've already covered that and how that has been a little bit geared towards men. But what about other aspects of representing? Do you feel that there are other challenges that you might face as women going into the session?
I do think Rachel brought up the schedule is something that is more geared towards the retired, older males, and some females are there too as well.
Because you have young kids, right,
Yeah,
Christy?
I have my kids range in age from 12 to 19, and so that, when they're with us, we're very busy, and so that may have an impact on us. And I do think one of the important things that's coming up is, North Carolina has never voted to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, and that's something that doesn't take priority in the legislature, and that's something that the women there would like to push forward. And right now it's been kind of on the second page, and we like to move it to the front page.
Okay, very interesting. And looking ahead to 2020, in my recollection of watching primaries for president, there's always been a woman here or there, but they've sort of been fringe candidates. And I'm wondering, Dr. Dittmar, if you think we might see something different in 2020, more women being considered as more serious candidates in primaries.
I certainly hope so. There is no shortage. There are no shortage of women who should be on the short list to consider as possible presidential contenders. At the same time, I was just looking at the CNN poll, I think that came out either over the weekend or the end of last week, and I looked at the 20-plus people that they put on the poll, and there were 4 women. And so we have to also remember that as we're thinking about 2020, media and pollsters all play a role in deciding who gets to be considered viable. And so even early on, even as we're talking about the possibility of having a woman candidate, I still think there are a lot more men, and particularly white men, that are often put forward by other players early on, and therefore they get a boost in terms of name recognition and attention. So I think it behooves us all to be thinking about all of the other women who are quite qualified to do this job, and raise them up a little bit. Even if they're, not ultimately going to run, it's good to have a good mix of people in that discussion, and that includes more women of color, and diversity of all types.
And I've heard a lot of women talked about, at least on the Democratic side. I know it's a little early. We don't know exactly who's going to be running yet, but do you sort of expect that the trends will continue since there's not a lot of talk about, an infrastructure for women on the Republican side, or is it just too early to know?
The trends in the partisan divide?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think at this point, it does look like that will continue because there doesn't seem to be a lot of urgency on the Republican side from the leadership. That said, you have women who have been speaking out. Elise Stefanik, representative in Congress, is just one voice that has been out there in recent weeks. Mia Love as well, who lost her race in Congress, saying that the party needs to do better. So to the extent that they can put some pressure on the party apparatus, and to the extent that it infiltrates voters and donors thinking on the Republican side, that they may fare better if they have more representation by gender, by race, in those who are running for office and those who are representing their party, then I think we see some progress. But I'm not sure we're there yet in the party leadership or the electorate on the Republican side really defining this as a problem in need of solving.
I see. And we only have about a minute left, but I just wanted to ask both of you, obviously you're newly elected representatives, but do you plan on encouraging women to run in future races, local, state?
Absolutely. I want to say to any woman who's thinking of running for office, just do it. Just jump in with both feet. And there's a great network of women with Lillian's List and Emily's List to back you up. And in fact, Rachel and I are part of a group of women who all were running for the House, and we supported each other throughout our race, through the good times and the bad, and we will continue to do that, and we will bring in other women who want to run for the House as well.
What about you, Rachel?
Yeah, in fact, we just got together with winners and losers at the governor's mansion this weekend. We were all invited, and we all went to dinner afterward, and everyone had a lot of stories to tell about the running and what it was like, and we will definitely support you. Please run for office.
That is Representative-elect Rachel Hunt. She is going to be representative of District 103 in the North Carolina House. Also joining us is Representative-elect Christy Clark. She will be representing District 98, North Mecklenburg. And by phone, joining us is Dr. Kelly Dittmar. She's a scholar at Rutgers University Center for American Women in Politics. Thank you all so much for joining us and talking about this Year of the Women. Hopefully we'll have more to talk about in future elections.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
We'll be right back after a break. This is Charlotte Talks.
Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and The Secret Chocolatier, hand-making chocolate and confections for gift baskets and desserts, located at Sharon Amity and Providence Road. Online ordering and shipping available at thesecretchocolatier.com. And Daniel Stowe Botanical Garden presenting Holidays at the Gardens, evening activities with lighted garden displays, live music, and the Children's Discovery Trail, now through January 6th. Details and tickets at dsbg.org. Coming up next at 10 on 1A, while the Mueller investigation has generated nearly endless speculation and headlines, the Southern District of New York is pursuing what NBC legal analyst Daniel Goldman says is a third flank of legal concern for President Donald Trump. Joshua Johnson and his experts catch up on the latest reports and look into what the Southern District of New York is investigating. It's coming up at 10 on 1A, here on 90.7 WFAE.
The holiday season means holiday parties. You make new friends, catch up with old ones, strike up interesting conversations. All Things Considered is a little like a holiday party too. We introduce you to new people, new perspectives, and new ideas. So consider this your invitation to All Things Considered. Hear the bigger picture every afternoon from NPR News.
Tune in for All Things Considered weekday afternoons from 4 to 6:30 on 90.7 WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source.
This is 90.7 WFAE. I am Alex Olgin, in for Mike Collins, and you're listening to Charlotte Talks. Until there's a hurricane or a controversy like the absentee ballot investigation in the 9th Congressional District, Bladen and Robeson counties don't receive much news attention. But these election issues aren't new either. Since they've been in the news so much this past month, here's a quick refresher. The North Carolina Board of Elections is refusing to certify the results of the congressional race between Republican Mark Harris and Democrat Dan McCready, citing possible election fraud, investigating irregularities with absentee mail-in ballots. Unofficial results show Harris won the race by a slim margin of 905 votes. Harris says he was absolutely unaware of any wrongdoing during his campaign, and McCready officials withdrew his concession. On Friday, Harris confirmed a Washington Post report that he made the call to hire McCrae Dowless, the man at the center of this saga. But there's much more to the story than just Dowless, who received a lot of national news attention because he's supposedly collected hundreds of absentee ballots. Robeson and Bladen County have had election issues for years. So to give us some context and tell us about what's been happening in these counties before they found themselves under national scrutiny is Michael Graff. He's a freelance journalist based in Charlotte and former editor of Charlotte Magazine. He spent 2 days in Bladen County working on a piece for Politico about the people and the climate in the county that made it ripe for this possible election fraud. And Donnie Douglas is the longtime editor for the Robesonian newspaper. Thank you both for joining me.
Thank you.
Yes. And so, yeah, great. And so we'll start with Michael. So you went down to Bladen County for, was it 2 days?
Yes.
And
better part 2.5 or so.
Okay. And so you wanted to talk to not the officials, you wanted to talk to just the people of Bladen County, right?
Yeah, that was sort of the point. I was, when the news broke, there was a lot of sort of finger pointing, and the finger pointing drilled down it went from large scale to criticizing the Republican Party, and then all of a sudden it got down to criticizing one person, and I knew from living in the area, I was a reporter for the Fayetteville Observer for 4 years. I knew from living in the area that it wasn't, election fraud. McCrae Dowless didn't just invent election fraud.
Right.
It doesn't just happen because one person brings it up. There's an environment there, and there are systems at play. And I really wanted to I wanted to go back out there because, Fayetteville, Cumberland, Robeson, and Bladen counties are places where crazy stories happen all the time. I knew that from when I was a newspaper reporter there, but this was more to find out why. And in the case of election fraud, I knew you had to have two parties at play. You had to have a ballot taker and a ballot giver.
Right.
And I wanted to know what environment produces folks that need that. And I think that what happened out there, it's very easy to point the finger at Bladen and Robeson counties and say, oh, look what they did, look what these counties have done. But what happened out there should really unnerve people around the country, because it's not necessarily a product of just this one place. It could happen in any area, I think, where there is some economic insecurity, where people are ready to take $100 cash for an easy job of going door to door, and where people may be vulnerable to giving their ballots because of, say you live in a county like Bladen, where the Cape Fear River goes right through the middle of it, and it's come over its banks twice in the past 3 years because of Matthew and Florence, and people are just tired. I think there's a lot of things at play there, and so I think we shouldn't stop and say this has happened here and the buck stops in Bladen and Robeson counties, because it could happen in a lot of rural areas in the country.
And one thing I want to make sure to distinguish, because I know, Donnie, you've made this point, is that the issues in Bladen and Robeson are different. Can you talk about sort of the issues that you found that are unique to Robeson?
Well, Michael kind of nailed it, to be honest with you.
Okay.
They're different. They're different in one sense, but they're exactly the same in the sense that Michael was pointing out. One of the things early on that I noticed was I was reading a lot of national media talking about Bladen and Robeson County. And so I went, and they were conflating the two in this particular instance. That's what's important here. Mm-hmm. And so I went and looked, and if you look at absentee ballots in Robeson County, they went disproportionate to Democrats. I mean, we had 50-50 races. The judge's race was 31,000 votes, and the absentees actually decided in favor of the Democratic candidate 2-1. And there was a Senate race that was a 60-40 race in favor of the Republican. But the Democrat won 2-1. But I want to be careful here. I'm not alleging anything, illegal here, although I certainly wouldn't doubt that happened. In Robeson, and I'm interested in Michael's spin on this, it's less partisanship because in Robeson County we've had what I would call in-person voter fraud for decades, but it was incestuous. It wasn't really because Republicans didn't have a presence in Robeson County. So, I always say we don't have corrupt, Republicans or Democrats in Robeson. We just have corrupt politicians. And so that's what I meant, that here it wasn't, Dallas didn't seem to, if he was being paid to turn out the vote for Harris in Robeson County, he did a really poor job.
I see. And so you mentioned that there's sort of, both of you have mentioned you're reporting in Bladen, Michael, and then you're reporting in Robeson, is that there's sort of this history. Like everyone's kind of knew that there were shenanigans going on, and it sort of came to a head. It's, as someone who doesn't live in those counties, it's surprising to me that there can be shenanigans for so long without anyone bringing it up in a formal way. I'll start with you, Michael. You go back to 2010 in your piece, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's the old saying that all politics is local, and in this case, it's really true. I mean, a lot of the feuds in Bladen County are over the sheriff's races, and I think that it's possible that you can, quote, get out the vote for a sheriff's race, and just also happen to have the same people vote for the same party in the congressional race. I think it's, for a lot of voters in Bladen County, I found that the most important election out there was the sheriff's race, not necessarily the congressional race.
It's so interesting.
So it's sort of like, does your neighbor get his position, or does the other neighbor get the position? And so it's neighbor on neighbor fights, and it is kind of interesting to see, the national attention come down on these places because it's I don't want to say it's funny, but it's almost like you get these. The stories sort of make it out to be like you've got these operatives. Well, it's not the mob coming down here.
Right.
This is just, it's people who are taking these jobs and taking these positions to do this, and it's not necessarily as I don't know how to put it. It's not innocent, and I don't want to make light of it, but because it's certainly a huge deal. But there are elements of it that are just as simple as old family feuds.
Mm-hmm. I understand that. When you live in a smaller place, people know more people, and things can get more personal for sure. I think I saw you quoted, Donnie, in another article talking about how the county has like the highest paid county commissioners in the state, but the second lowest funded schools. I found that so interesting. Do you feel like that's representative of just other sort of political shenanigans that have gone in Robeson County for a while?
I mean, yeah, I always say that our dirty little secret is, election fraud, except it's not a secret. We've been just kind of, laughing at it. I haven't been laughing. We've been raising Cain, but really without a whole lot of success, to be honest with you. Some things have happened this year that I think are pointing in a positive direction. But yeah, I mean, if you really think about this, we have the best paid and benefited commissioners in state, and we looked at this, okay, and we had the second worst funded system. And how is that allowed, a school system? So how is that allowed to perpetuate itself? It's to get out the vote, money. We have a county commissioner, I'll say his name, Jerry Stevens, and his wife, Wixie Stevens, who make thousands of dollars on election day, doing what Michael talked about was done in Bladen. We all kind of know what goes on. I mean, we've had so many do-over elections in Robeson County. I've been the editor 22 years. I mean, I really can't even count them. Because, every year we hear about this, okay, that, the 2007 city council election, which ended kind of in a tie. And, we're hearing about coupons being given to people to vote for one candidate. They do a do-over election, it ended in a tie, and it ended up like 240 to 160. Those are the kind of things that kind of validate what we hear. But I'm like thrilled. I'm not thrilled that there's that this happened in Bladen County necessarily, but I'm thrilled that the national media is paying attention to what's happened, routinely in Robeson and Bladen counties, because it's affected a federal outcome.
Mm-hmm.
When it's affected, the city council or the county commissioners, it gets a big shrug. So, I'm hopeful that some positive stuff will come out of that. Let me just say this real quick.
Yeah.
But I've never even heard of absentee fraud in Robeson County until this year. Okay. And we actually did a story, and nobody else had heard about it. This is kind of a new thing to us. So that's kind of interesting.
Very interesting. So I think I saw your article in your paper where you said you want this outside investigation and no local investigations. You want the feds to come in and do it.
Absolutely. I don't think we just elected a new sheriff, and the DA, I think, is an honorable person. But, we also call for a new election, and we also call for a new primary. Obviously, I think those things are probably going to happen. But there's a judicial race locally, too, that probably needs to be done over again, too, because of what I said about the absentee ballots. That, you had one winner on November 6th, and then after provisionals and absentees are counted, and those things usually don't flip elections. But this is stuff, it needs to end. And we've been a big supporter of voter ID. I've been very criticized for that. But Robeson County, 63% of the people that voted in favor of voter ID, and remember our demographic, we're 70% minority and 70 plus, maybe 73% Democrat. And so I think that's a little bit indicative that people don't trust what's going on locally. Mm-hmm. And that's why we have corrupt county commissioners. And, I don't use that word, easily. I mean, these are not honorable people.
Well, and we know there has been convictions over the years, so it's not like you're just throwing around the accusation. So Kirby emails us and says, is one reason this flourished because that region of the state could be considered a news desert without a vibrant media like we have in some bigger cities? What are your thoughts on that, Michael?
I wouldn't say that's.
And of course, not to discount Donnie and the Robesonian.
No.
That's all right. I'm just a little offended.
No. Well, I mean, in Bladen, you get a little farther out, and they do have the Bladen Journal out there, and they have Bladen Online. But I do think that it's possible that the farther away you get from information hubs, the less folks participate, I guess, in are actively engaged in everyday conversations that we seem to have here regularly. I mean, I think one of the conversations, and I've lived in Rocky Mount and Fayetteville and lots of places in North Carolina and really love this state. But one of the conversations I had with my editor at Politico was that, nobody goes down my street here in Charlotte and just outside of Uptown and asks me for my absentee ballot or asks me to fill out an absentee ballot request form. And I that question sort of drove me as I was going out there. I was like, so why is it? We have I don't know if information deserts are part of the problem, but we do have far more media sources here in Charlotte than they do in Bladen County. I think I think a larger issue is probably trust, like Donnie alluded to. I think trust in local politics or trust in any politics or trust in any system in general is very low out there. I met a woman named Fanny in Bladen County who worked at the Smithfield packing plant out there, the largest employer in town. She was in her 60s. She retired after 30 years. She lived in Bladen Borough. She's a black woman who moved down here from New York 30 years ago. And I said, so what do you think of all this going on in Bladen County? She says, it's been going on for years. And she says, I don't trust any of it. I don't trust any of this at all. And then she went on to talk to me about the Smithfield packing plant and some of the things she didn't trust about that place. And she even said to me, she said, I used to see people take meat out of the back of the building and sell it out of the back of their cars. And I said, I said, that's quite an amazing story. And Fanny said to me, she said, no, it isn't. Do you find things amazing anymore?
Wow. Just the distrust, the sort of disillusionment. I mean, I know, Donnie, when you talked about how many do-over elections there were, there must be fatigue. I mean, I can only imagine if so many of the elections I voted in were just do-overs. I mean, I don't want to say I would throw my hands up and say, forget it, doesn't even matter. But do you feel like there's that sense there at all?
Well, I think there's an acceptance, fatigue on our part that we go through these things every year. As far as we've been kicking and screaming for years. I've been somewhat frustrated because I have at times talked to some of the more major, it's not often that a local newspaper invites in, the regional or the state newspaper, but say, why don't y'all look at this? But I don't, again, until it affected a federal election, I don't think anybody really cared. But, Michael touched on it early on. I think that there's a general, just our demographic. We're the poorest county in the state, but we have the best paid commissioners. And then we talked about before, we have a bad school system, let's just say it that way. And so, another thing that I didn't touch upon, each of our county commissioners has what they call a $30,000 discretionary fund. Now, they get to spend $30,000 a year any way they want, okay, with no oversight, okay, except a vote. And it doesn't have you don't have to give it to the United Way. You can give it to whatever. Just think about how much favoritism or favor, or how many votes that potentially buys around election time.
Yeah.
I mean, what they have done, what they have the way they've honored themselves is incredible. The average term on the county commissioner, I think, is about 18 years. We did have one die recently that obviously will pull that average term down, but four and a half terms, 18 years. Wow. And it's not like this county's achieving. We're kind of last in everything you want to be first in, and first in everything you're last in. So, it's I think it's just kind of a perfect soup, and of people who are underinformed and are willing to give their vote for a coupon.
A recipe, like you mentioned. We could talk about this for hours more, I'm sure. Thank you so much, Donnie Douglas, editor at the Robesonian, and Michael Graff, freelance journalist based in Charlotte, for both of your reporting and for talking to me about this hour. This is Charlotte Talks. I'm Alex Olgin, in for Mike Collins.